Here's something most people misunderstand about an avoidant person after you're gone. The silence doesn't necessarily hit them immediately. In fact, sometimes the first reaction is relief. They may feel like the pressure has disappeared. There are no difficult conversations, no emotional expectations, no questions about where the relationship is going, and no need to explain what they're feeling. But relief and peace are not always the same thing. That distinction matters. When someone has learned to protect themselves through emotional distance, separation can initially feel like control. They may tell themselves, "This is better. I need space. I can finally breathe." And perhaps, for a moment, they genuinely believe it. But then something interesting happens. The external noise disappears, and the internal noise becomes louder. When you were there, your presence may have provided a kind of emotional background they barely noticed. Your messages, your questions, your encouragement, the way you remembered small details, the way you showed up. Even the simple knowledge that someone cared whether they had a good day. They may not have consciously valued those things while they had them, because human beings often adapt to what is consistently available. We become accustomed to the things that stabilize us. Think about the air you breathe. You rarely think about it because it is always there. But remove it, and suddenly its importance becomes undeniable. Emotional presence can work in a similar way. Something can become so familiar that its significance remains invisible until its absence creates a contrast. And that is where silence becomes powerful. When you stop reaching out, you don't simply remove communication. You remove a pattern. The avoidant no longer knows that you will send the next message. They no longer know that you will initiate the conversation after tension. They no longer have the reassurance that, even if they pull away, you will eventually come looking for them. And suddenly the relationship is no longer being emotionally maintained by your effort. That can create a confrontation with reality, because as long as you were chasing, they could interpret your persistence as proof that they had control. But when you stop chasing, they are left with something far more uncomfortable, their own choices. They have to sit with the possibility that the person they assumed would always be there may not be there anymore. And notice the difference here. This isn't about playing games. It isn't about disappearing to manipulate somebody into missing you. That's not emotional strength. That's another form of attachment. Real strength is being willing to stop abandoning yourself in order to keep someone else close. That's the deeper lesson. If someone needs your constant pursuit to remain connected to you, the relationship has already become unbalanced. You cannot build genuine intimacy by continuously convincing another person to participate in it. So when you step back, you aren't trying to punish the avoidant, you're allowing reality to speak. And reality is often much louder than words. In your absence, they may begin noticing the small things they previously dismissed, the conversations they took for granted, the emotional safety they didn't recognize, the consistency they assumed would continue forever. And this is where psychological reflection begins. They may ask themselves questions they avoided when you were present. Why do I miss them now? Why does the silence bother me? Why am I checking my phone? Why am I thinking about that conversation again? Did I push away someone who actually cared about me? Those questions don't guarantee that an avoidant will return. They don't guarantee transformation, and they certainly don't mean you should wait around hoping for it. What they do represent is something more important, the possibility of awareness, because sometimes a person doesn't understand the value of connection while they're busy protecting themselves from it. Your absence can reveal what your presence allowed them to ignore. And this is why you must be careful about what you do next. Don't rush back simply because you sense that they're beginning to miss you. Don't confuse someone's discomfort with your absence for emotional readiness. Missing you is not the same as being prepared to love you differently. Let them experience the consequence of distance, and you experience something too. You discover that you can survive without chasing. You discover that your worth doesn't increase because someone finally recognizes it. You discover that love should never require you to continuously prove that you're worthy of being chosen. The greatest transformation happens when you stop making their reaction the measure of your value. Because the moment you no longer need them to come back, you become free to decide whether their return actually deserves a place in your future. And remember this, sometimes your absence doesn't create the truth, it simply reveals the truth that your presence allowed someone to avoid. Now, once the silence has settled in, something else can begin to happen. The avoidant may start remembering not simply who you were, but how they felt around you. And that distinction is incredibly important, because people often don't recognize emotional safety while they are experiencing it. They recognize it later, when they encounter its absence. Think about what emotional safety actually means. It isn't constant reassurance. It isn't someone agreeing with everything you say. It isn't the absence of conflict. Emotional safety is the experience of being able to exist as yourself without constantly feeling that you have to defend, hide, perform, or escape. And for someone who has developed a strong instinct to protect their independence, that kind of safety can feel strangely unfamiliar. They may want closeness, but closeness can trigger vulnerability. They may desire connection, but connection can activate the fear of losing autonomy. So when intimacy becomes intense, they retreat. They create distance. They convince themselves that they are better off alone. But distance changes perception. When you're no longer there, they may begin comparing what they have now with what they experienced with you. And suddenly, qualities they once considered ordinary can become extraordinary. Your patience, your consistency, your willingness to listen, the way you gave them room without completely abandoning the relationship, the way you could challenge them without trying to control them. These things may have seemed insignificant because they were reliable, but reliability has a strange psychological effect. We notice it most clearly when it disappears. That's why you should never underestimate the impact of consistency. Anybody can be intensely affectionate for a few days. Anybody can make dramatic promises when emotions are high. But emotional safety is built through repetition. It is created when someone consistently behaves in a way that tells your nervous system, you don't have to be on guard here. And perhaps that is what the avoidant begins remembering. Not necessarily one grand romantic moment, but dozens of small moments. The conversation where you listened without judging. The day you supported them when they were overwhelmed. The way you didn't demand an immediate answer. The way you made them laugh. The ordinary moments that didn't seem important at the time. Memory is selective, but emotional memory can be remarkably persistent. When the relationship is active, the mind often focuses on what is difficult. After separation, however, perspective can shift. The conflict becomes one part of the story instead of the entire story, and suddenly, they may remember the good that existed alongside the fear. This is where many people make a mistake. They think, if they missed the safety I gave them, I should go back and provide it again. No. Your responsibility is not to become someone's permanent emotional shelter while they refuse to learn how to participate in a healthy relationship. You can offer safety, but you cannot manufacture emotional maturity for another person. You can be patient, but you cannot do their inner work. You can communicate clearly, but you cannot force someone to confront the beliefs that make intimacy frightening. That's the philosophical truth behind relationships. You can invite another person into connection, but you cannot drag them into it. And when you're gone, they may finally begin recognizing what they had because they are forced to experience life without it. But here's the part you need to understand. Their realization doesn't automatically mean reconciliation. Someone can miss your kindness and still be afraid of intimacy. Someone can remember your emotional safety and still repeat old patterns. Someone can regret losing you and still lack the courage to change. So don't measure transformation by how intensely someone misses you. Measure it by what they do differently. That's the standard. If they return with the same emotional habits, the same inconsistency, the same avoidance, and the same unwillingness to communicate, then their nostalgia isn't enough, because you don't need someone who simply misses the comfort you provided. You need someone who is willing to participate in the relationship that created that comfort. And this is where your own growth becomes essential. You must stop asking, how do I make them remember me? Start asking, what kind of relationship am I willing to accept? That question changes everything. Because when you know your standards, you stop being hypnotized by temporary attention. You stop confusing longing with commitment. You stop believing that someone's fear is your responsibility to fix. You understand that your value was never created by their ability to recognize it. And sometimes the greatest thing your absence can teach another person is the value of what they were too afraid to fully receive. So remember this, let your absence reveal your value, but never make your life dependent on someone else's realization. And then we come to one of the most uncomfortable experiences that can follow your absence, the replay. When you were together, the avoidant may have focused primarily on what felt threatening in the relationship. The questions, the emotional conversations, the expectations, the moments when closeness felt overwhelming. Their mind may have been busy creating reasons to step back, but once you're gone, the immediate pressure disappears, and that creates room for reflection. They may begin replaying conversations they once dismissed. They remember the moment you asked for clarity. They remember when you told them you were hurt. They remember the times they became distant and you tried to understand rather than attack them. And suddenly the story begins to look different. This is one of the strange things about human psychology. When we're emotionally activated, we often interpret events through the lens of self-protection. We don't necessarily see reality as it is. We see reality as our nervous system believes it needs to see it. If intimacy feels dangerous, a loving question can feel like pressure. If vulnerability feels threatening, emotional honesty can feel like criticism. If dependence feels frightening, someone's desire for closeness can feel like control. But once the emotional intensity is gone, the mind sometimes has enough distance to reconsider the interpretation, and that's when the questions begin. Was I too harsh? Did I misunderstand what they were asking for? Why did I pull away when they were simply trying to connect? Why did I assume they would always come back? Did I create the distance I was afraid of? Those questions can be powerful because they force a person to confront something much deeper than the loss of a relationship. They force them to confront their own pattern, and that is often much harder. It's easier to say, the relationship wasn't right, than to say, I had a role in destroying something that might have been meaningful. It's easier to blame incompatibility than to examine your own fear. It's easier to say, they wanted too much, than to ask whether you were capable of receiving what they were offering. This is where regret can begin. But understand something important. Regret isn't always a sign of transformation. Someone can regret losing you without understanding why they pushed you away. They can miss you without developing the emotional capacity required to build something healthier. They can feel guilty and still repeat the same behavior. That's why you shouldn't romanticize their potential regret. Instead, understand what it represents. The replay is an opportunity for awareness. They may begin connecting dots that were previously separate. They may realize that every time closeness increased, they created distance. Every time you asked for emotional honesty, they became defensive. Every time the relationship began feeling serious, they found a reason to retreat. And eventually, they may recognize the pattern. I wasn't protecting myself from the wrong person. I was protecting myself from vulnerability. That realization can be painful. Because once you see a pattern clearly, you can no longer comfortably pretend it isn't there. And this is why your absence can become such a powerful mirror. You are no longer there to explain everything. You are no longer there to argue your intentions. You are no longer there to reassure them that you still care. They are left alone with their interpretation of what happened, and sometimes silence creates the space where accountability finally becomes possible. But here's where you need to be disciplined. Do not rush back because you imagine they are replaying the past. Don't send another message just to give them an opportunity to explain themselves. Don't interrupt the process because you're uncomfortable with uncertainty. If someone needs to understand what they lost, let them understand it. Your job is not to manage their realization. Your job is to manage your own life. And while they may be replaying old conversations, you should be creating new ones with yourself. Ask yourself what you learned. Ask yourself where you ignored your own needs. Ask yourself why you accepted inconsistency for so long. Ask yourself whether you were trying to earn someone's love instead of simply receiving the love that was freely offered. Because this is where the entire dynamic changes. The goal isn't to make an avoidant regret losing you. The goal is to become so grounded in your own worth that whether they regret it or not no longer determines your emotional stability. If they return, let their behavior speak. If they don't, let your growth speak. Because the past should be studied, not lived in. And sometimes the greatest consequence of losing you isn't that someone misses you, it is that they finally have to confront the version of themselves that made losing you possible. Your absence can trigger their reflection, but your growth must become your transformation. And this brings us to another realization that can become incredibly powerful after you leave. They begin to understand that your attention was never guaranteed. While you were present, there may have been an assumption operating quietly in the background. Even if they pulled away, became distant, stopped communicating, or created emotional uncertainty, some part of them may have believed that you would eventually return. You would send the message. You would ask what was wrong. You would try to repair the tension. You would explain yourself again. You would make another attempt. And because that pattern repeated, your attention could begin to feel permanent. But when you finally stop participating in that cycle, something changes. The dynamic changes. Not because you're manipulating them, but because you're no longer carrying the entire relationship by yourself. This is an important distinction. There is a difference between withdrawing to create a reaction and stepping back because you have decided to respect yourself. One is a strategy. The other is self-respect. And self-respect changes the psychological equation completely. When you stop chasing someone, you're not necessarily telling them, I don't care about you. You're saying, I care about myself enough to stop forcing a connection that requires only my effort. That message can be powerful because it removes the illusion of unlimited access. They may begin to realize that your kindness had limits, your patience had limits, your availability had limits, your emotional energy had limits. And perhaps most importantly, your willingness to wait forever had limits. That's when absence can become more meaningful than presence ever was. Because presence can be taken for granted, absence cannot. When someone knows you're always available, they don't have to make an immediate decision about your value. They can postpone appreciation. They can postpone accountability. They can tell themselves they'll deal with the relationship later, but when you're genuinely gone, later becomes uncertain. And uncertainty has a way of exposing what we have been avoiding. They may begin wondering whether you have met someone else, whether you've stopped thinking about them, whether you've emotionally detached, whether the door they assumed would always remain open is actually closing. But again, don't confuse their uncertainty with your responsibility. You don't need to create jealousy. You don't need to post things designed to get their attention. You don't need to prove that you're doing better. You don't need to manufacture a reaction. Your life should not become a performance designed for someone who isn't currently participating in it. That's the deeper psychological shift. You stop living in reaction to their behavior. You start living according to your values. And when that happens, something remarkable occurs. You become less emotionally dependent on the outcome. If they reach out, you can evaluate their actions. If they don't, you continue moving forward. If they apologize, you can listen without immediately surrendering your standards. If they return, you can ask whether they are returning with genuine change or simply returning because they miss the comfort of your presence. That distinction is everything. Because somebody missing your attention doesn't necessarily mean they are ready for your relationship. They may miss the emotional reassurance. They may miss knowing someone cared. They may miss having access to you. But mature love requires more than missing someone. It requires responsibility. It requires communication. It requires consistency. It requires the courage to stay present when intimacy becomes uncomfortable. And that's why your absence should never be used as a weapon. Let it be a boundary. Let it communicate that your love is valuable precisely because it is freely given, not endlessly extracted. And perhaps the most important transformation happens inside you. You begin realizing that you don't have to convince anyone to choose you. You don't have to compete for basic attention. You don't have to become smaller so someone feels comfortable. You don't have to accept emotional inconsistency simply because you are afraid of losing the person. Because when you are terrified of losing someone, you can accidentally start losing yourself, and that's too high a price. So if they eventually recognize that your attention is gone, let them recognize it. If they wonder why you're no longer chasing, let the silence answer. And if they come back, don't ask only, do they still want me? Ask the more powerful question. Are they now capable of giving me the kind of relationship I deserve? Because your goal isn't to become unforgettable to someone. Your goal is to become unshakable within yourself. Never chase someone into recognizing your value. Build a life so rooted in self-respect that recognition becomes optional. And now we arrive at the deepest fear that can emerge after you've truly stepped away, the possibility that you are no longer waiting for them. Because as long as someone believes the door is always open, they can postpone making a decision. They can tell themselves, I'll come back when I'm ready. They can create distance today and imagine that connection will still be available tomorrow. But life doesn't work that way. People change, circumstances change, and sometimes while one person is deciding whether they're ready to move closer, the other person is learning how to move forward. That is when the avoidant may begin confronting a possibility they never wanted to consider. You might actually be moving on. Not pretending to move on, not posting pictures to provoke jealousy, not trying to make them regret losing you, actually moving on. And there is a profound psychological difference between those two things. When you genuinely begin rebuilding your life, your attention shifts. You stop monitoring their behavior. You stop checking whether they viewed something. You stop analyzing every silence. You stop constructing imaginary conversations in your head. Your emotional center returns to you. And that can be difficult for someone who became accustomed to having access to your attention. They may suddenly wonder, what if I waited too long? That question can be uncomfortable because time removes the illusion of infinite opportunity. You can postpone a conversation. You can postpone vulnerability. You can postpone commitment. But you cannot postpone time itself. And sometimes the person who was afraid of losing their independence eventually becomes afraid that their distance has cost them the relationship entirely. This is where regret can become intense. They may remember moments when you were reaching for them and they were pulling away. They may remember the opportunities they had to communicate honestly. They may remember the times you asked for consistency and they responded with distance. And now the emotional equation has changed. You are no longer asking them to choose you. They are left wondering whether you would choose them again. That reversal can be psychologically powerful. But here's the part that matters most for you. Don't make their fear of losing you the objective. Your objective is not to become the person they are terrified to lose. Your objective is to become the person who refuses to lose themselves. That's a completely different philosophy. Because if you spend your life trying to trigger someone's fear of losing you, you're still giving them control over your emotional state. You are still asking, what can I do to make them react? Freedom begins when the question becomes, What do I need to do to honor myself? And honoring yourself may mean accepting something difficult. Sometimes people realize your value too late. Sometimes they come back. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they return with genuine growth. Sometimes they return because they are lonely. Sometimes they miss you. Sometimes they miss the emotional comfort you provided. And sometimes they finally understand what they lost. But you cannot build your future around possibilities. You build it around evidence. If someone returns, look at behavior. Are they communicating differently? Are they taking responsibility? Are they willing to have difficult conversations? Are they consistent? Are they making room for your needs instead of expecting you to adapt to their fears? Those are the questions that matter. Because anyone can say, I miss you, but missing someone is an emotion. Building a healthy relationship is a decision, and decisions require action. So if an avoidant eventually realizes that you've genuinely moved on, let that realization belong to them. You don't need to announce it. You don't need to prove it. You don't need to make them jealous. Just live it. Build the life you were postponing while waiting for someone else to decide what they wanted. Reconnect with yourself. Invest in your goals. Strengthen your relationships. Develop your confidence. Become emotionally available to life again. And if they come back, you won't be standing there desperate for validation. You'll be standing there with clarity. You'll be able to ask, does this person fit the life I've built, or am I being tempted to return to the life I outgrew? That's maturity. Because love is not supposed to be a negotiation where one person waits indefinitely while the other decides whether they are ready. Love requires two people who are willing to participate. And sometimes the most powerful consequence of your absence isn't that someone finally chases you. It's that you finally stop chasing what was never consistently choosing you. So let this be the lesson. Never build your life around the possibility that someone might come back. Build a life so meaningful that if they do return, you can choose from strength rather than wait from fear. And there is another realization that can become deeply uncomfortable after you are gone. The possibility that someone else may give you the kind of love, consistency, and emotional presence they were unwilling or unable to give. This is not necessarily about jealousy in the superficial sense. It is something deeper. It is the confrontation with replacement. When someone has become accustomed to believing that you will remain emotionally connected to them, they may unconsciously assume that the role they occupy in your life will always remain available. They may believe that even if they create distance, some part of you will remain emotionally attached. But what happens when you begin experiencing connection somewhere else? What happens when you meet people who communicate clearly? People who don't disappear when intimacy increases? People who don't make you question where you stand? People who don't require you to decode their feelings every day? Suddenly the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. And that contrast can be powerful because human beings often evaluate experiences relationally. We don't always understand what was unhealthy until we experience something healthier. You may have spent months wondering whether you were asking for too much. Maybe you wanted consistency. Maybe you wanted communication. Maybe you wanted reassurance. Maybe you wanted someone who could remain emotionally present when things became uncomfortable. And perhaps you were made to feel as though those desires were excessive. But then you encounter someone who provides them naturally. And you realize you weren't asking for too much. You were asking the wrong person. That realization can transform the way you see the entire relationship. And if an avoidant becomes aware that you are experiencing that kind of connection elsewhere, it may force them to confront a painful comparison. Not necessarily, someone stole this person from me, but rather, someone else is giving them what I repeatedly failed to give. That is a much more confronting thought, because now the problem cannot easily be blamed on your needs. If you are happy without them, their previous explanation may begin to collapse. If they once believed you were too demanding, but you thrive with someone who appreciates your emotional depth, they may have to reconsider that belief. If they thought closeness itself was the problem, they may discover that you are capable of being close to someone else without the same conflict. And that can bring them face to face with their own pattern. But I want you to understand something very clearly. You should never build another relationship simply to make someone from your past jealous. That isn't healing. That's still attachment. That's still allowing the old relationship to control your new life. If you genuinely meet someone who treats you well, don't use that person as a message to your ex. Allow them to be a person. Allow the relationship to be real. Allow yourself to experience what consistency feels like without constantly comparing it to what you lost. Because the deepest victory isn't making an avoidant realize someone else wants you. The deepest victory is realizing you no longer need to be wanted by someone who couldn't consistently choose you. That is freedom. And freedom changes your standards. You begin noticing that chemistry without consistency isn't enough. Attraction without emotional availability isn't enough. Potential without action isn't enough. Apologies without changed behavior aren't enough. You stop falling in love with what someone could become and start paying attention to who they consistently are. And if an avoidant sees that transformation in you, they may experience something they never anticipated. They may realize that the person they once assumed would remain available has developed the ability to choose differently. That's significant, because your growth changes the power dynamic without you ever trying to create a power dynamic. You are simply no longer negotiating against your own needs. And if they return, this is where your discernment matters. Don't ask, are they afraid someone else will have me? Ask, have they become capable of loving me in a healthier way? Don't ask, do they regret losing me? Ask, do their actions demonstrate accountability? Don't ask, do they still have feelings? Ask, can those feelings translate into consistency? Those questions separate emotional drama from emotional maturity, because someone can fear losing you and still be incapable of sustaining a healthy relationship with you. Their fear is not your proof, their behavior is, so continue moving forward. Don't shrink your life because someone from your past might eventually notice your absence. Don't keep yourself emotionally unavailable to everyone else because you're waiting for one person to become ready. And don't confuse loyalty with indefinite waiting. Loyalty to another person should never require betrayal of yourself. Sometimes the most powerful thing an avoidant can witness is not another person loving you. It is you finally accepting that love should feel safe enough to stay. And when you discover that, you stop asking who will chase you. You start asking who is willing to walk beside you. That's the standard that changes everything. Never compete to be chosen when you have the power to choose what kind of love belongs in your life.